Friends, the Lord be with you. Once again, welcome to Western Theological Seminary. Welcome to the 2023 edition of the Bast Preaching Festival. We have not been able to host this festival for a few years, so we're excited that we're able to resurrect it for this year. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. The Bast Preaching Festival was established in honor of Dr. Henry Bast, who served as professor of practical theology here at Western from 1956 to 1963. He was a renowned preacher. He is often quoted by his students who remember him how he would often go up to them and tell them to be ready in a moment's notice to pray, preach, or die. Dr. Bast also served as the pastor of Richmond Reformed Church, served 2 stints as the pastor of Bethany Reformed Church. He will also serve as a college pastor and professor of Bible at Hope College before serving at Words of Hope until he retired. In 1986, the Bast Preaching Festival was established in his honor. And today we are honored that Reverend David Bast, the son of Henry, is also here to offer a workshop as a part of this year's festival. Along with establishing the Bast Preaching Festival, Western Theological Seminary also established the Henry Bast Chair of Preaching. That chair was renamed as the Henry Bast and Tim Brown Chair of Preaching in 2019 to also honor President Emeritus, Reverend Dr. Tim Brown, the 11th president of the seminary and also my immediate predecessor. Today we are honored that Dr. Brown is also here in our presence. Thank you for being here. The Bast Preaching Festival is an initiative designed to emphasize preaching as a vocation worthy of our lives. It is an opportunity for pastors, teachers, and communicators to gather together and grow through lectures, workshops, and worship. It is an opportunity for us all to dwell in the Bible and allow the Word of God to dwell in us. Our speaker for the Bast Preaching Festival this year is Dr. Jared Alcántara, who served as the Powell Endowed Chair in Preaching at Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. Dr. Alcántara is a graduate of Wheaton College and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary before earning his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, writing his dissertation on Reverend Gardner Taylor, who is widely considered as the Dean of American Preaching. Dr. Alcántara is also a prolific author. In addition to writing 2 volumes on Gardner Taylor, one of which I have here today, Learning from a Legend, what Gardner C. Taylor can teach us about preaching. He also published The Practices of Christian Preaching, a volume that was simultaneously published in English and Spanish, and more recently in December, an excellent volume on how to preach Proverbs. Before we invite Dr. Alcántara to the lectern, I want to make sure that I give a word of thanks to so many who have worked diligently to put this festival together. I want to, I don't see Sherry Westhouse in the room. She's busy. If you see her running around, Sherry Westhouse, then a lot of the work in putting together today's event. Lindsay Porter also ably assisted and provided leadership to putting this event together. You have Ann and Chansky and Cindy Heisinga who prepared our live stream. You see Kathy Amon there who's helping us record. AJ Funk and his wife Vanessa also helped us with sound and technology. And if you were here for chapel, you'll notice that David Becker and a group of others quickly transformed this room from a chapel worship space to now a lecture space. So it really shows you how much work can be done in 15 minutes with able leadership. So thank you all for all your help in preparing today's event. Before we invite Dr. Alcántara to the lectern, we will open with prayer offered by our Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Kristen D.D. Johnson, who also serves as the G.W. and Edna Hayward Chair Professor of Educational Ministries and Leadership. After the lecture, the Q&A time will be led and moderated by Dr. Ron Rienstra, our Professor of Preaching and Worship Arts and also our Director of Worship Life. Dr. Johnson, will you come and lead us in prayer?
Let us pray. God, you are the giver of all good gifts. And this morning we pause to thank you for the gift of preaching, the gift of your word made flesh, the gift of your word made known to us through Scripture, and the gift of your word proclaimed. And with that gift comes responsibility, and we sense the weight of that, as Dr. Alcántara reminded us in chapel, of the complexity of this moment here and around the world. We need your wisdom. So please guide us together as we receive and attend to the gift of preaching, and also as we try to steward the responsibility faithfully and creatively and intentionally for the church of today and the church that you are preparing the way for. We thank you for the great cloud of witnesses, those who have gone before us, those in this room who have prepared the way, previous Bast Preaching Festival speakers, professors of preaching, and those around the world who've gone before us and continue to proclaim your word faithfully. And we pray that you will be especially present to Dr. Alcántara as he leads us today, and every workshop leader as well. Help us to think and wrestle and see together what faithfulness might look like. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. Once again, it's good to be with you. Thank you to President Felix Theonagraha. Thank you to Dean Kristen Johnson. Thank you, all of you, as so many familiar faces, friendly faces, people that I've known through the years. So it feels like a reunion in so many different ways. Yesterday, someone from the Western Seminary staff contacted me and said, originally your plans were to go out to dinner with Felix and Esther, but they think so highly of you and love you so much that you'll actually be watching their kids while they go out to dinner. So I canceled that. I said, no, I've come too far, and I'm hungry. And they said, okay, well, we'll change our plans. But with all that stated, let me get into our subject for this session, Sermons 2040, Preaching in an Intercultural Church with an Intercultural Future. Now, I made gestures toward that end when I picked the text for today, Luke chapter 3, this idea of passing through a wilderness and what it means to be a voice crying in the wilderness. For in many ways, pastors, Christian leaders feel like they're going through a wilderness time. What does it mean to be the church in the 21st century and in this decade in the 21st century? What does it mean that so much is changing in our society? What does it sound like to preach sermons that are not only timeless, but timely, that are not only for every age, but for this age in which we find ourselves? Now, in order to work our way into this subject, let me begin with a popular narrative. And I do want to treat this narrative with a level of seriousness as I introduce it to you. Christianity After Religion. This is the book published by Diana Butler Bass in 2012. And in that book, she suggests the following. The first decade of the 21st century in the United States could rightly be called the Great Religious Recession. She claims that Christian belief and practice are experiencing a precipitous decline, and that general belief in God has eroded in the last 30 years. I'm quoting from her here. She cites recent USA Today polls. She cites the latest statistics highlighting precipitous numerical decline in traditional mainline denominations. She notes the statistical increases among those who self-identify through terms like religiously unaffiliated, spiritual but not religious, atheist, agnostic, especially the rapid increases compared to one generation ago. In a way, she's signaling that the nail has been hammered in the proverbial coffin. And there's truth to it. The missiologist Andrew Walls also makes this observation, quote, "Many signs are visible in the United States now that marked Europe when its own rapid retreat from Christianity began." Some of these trends are alarming, disturbing, especially to those of us who have given our lives to serve local churches, have invested ourselves in theological education, what will become of the church that we love, what will become of the seminaries and divinity schools that we give our lives to, that we serve. They're in good company. You have the famous Canadian philosopher, the well-known, widely regarded Charles Taylor, in his book, A Secular Age, points to the fact that in the 1500s it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, while in the 2000s there are many who find this not only easy, but even inescapable to not believe in God. In the 1500s, the natural world pointed to, quote, God's divine action and purpose. God was implicated in the very existence of society. People lived in what Taylor calls an enchanted world. But a change has been abroad. He defines it this way. The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. A move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among others, and frequently not the easiest to embrace. Leslie Newbigin makes this observation in his book, Foolishness to the Greeks, where he says that a culture in which Christianity was once pervasive can become a culture that is more resistant to the original pagan society in which Christianity was introduced. As I was thinking about Taylor and Bass and Walls and Newbigin's observations, for some reason my mind went to a scene in a film. In Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, two men are pushing a cart filled with people who have died of the plague. As they walk through the village, they shout, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." One of the villagers loads an old man onto the cart, and he says, "This man here is dead." And it turns out that he's not. He's actually sick, but he's very much alive, and replies, "I'm not dead yet. I'm getting better." The younger man says, "You'll be stone dead in a moment." And the man replies, "I don't want to go in the cart." "Oh, don't be such a baby. I'm not dead yet." So we have a popular narrative, and we need to take that seriously. But what if Bass's assertions, and those of many others on this subject, represent a pronouncement that has truth to it, but that could also be challenged in some way? What if the doomsday prophecies about churches and seminaries in the United States have truth to them, but might also be short-sighted? What if we haven't considered all of the possible data? What if we're not dead yet? Maybe I'll pose the question this way. How might the narrative change concerning Christianity's demise in the United States if somehow there were countervailing data to support an alternative interpretation? Say, data that highlighted a meaningful connection between Christianity's move south and east and the current demographic shifts and projections for the populations in the United States. If Christianity has moved south and east, then what do we make of the fact that the majority of immigrants who come to the United States and the subpopulations within the United States that are growing the fastest at an exponential rate also happen to come from these regions? What do we make of the fact that those who are documented immigrants, and I'm not even including undocumented immigrants here, that 2 out of 3 of them self-identify as Christians? These shifts have been happening for some time, and I want to argue today that they should impact our preaching. This is a chart or a visual of documented immigration in the 1960s. 49% of immigrants came from Europe, Canada, and Oceania. 49% came from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and then another 2% were unspecified. Now, there were a lot of shifts in our policies related to immigration in the 1960s, which opened doors that had previously been closed, so I should at least mention that. But that was the 1960s, and this is 2019. Europe, Canada, and Oceania representing 11%, 1% unspecified, 88% from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. That's 34% from Asia, 43% from Latin America, and 11% from Africa. The projections for 2040 into 2050 are quite fascinating. The U.S. is projected to grow by 2 million people per year, from 285 million in 2000 to 409 million by the time we get to 2050. Around 2010, 2011, 1 in 8 were foreign-born. By 2021, it's 1 in 7. And by the 2040s, that's 1 in 5. So if you count down your row, one person in your row of 5 will have been born in another nation besides the United States, likely in Latin America, Asia, or Africa. The African American population is projected to grow. The Asian American population is projected to triple in size. The Latinx population is projected to triple in size. The year 2010 was the first year that more minoritized babies were born in the U.S. than majority babies. The year 2014 was the first year that more non-white children were the majority in public schools. This is from 2019. Median age for those who are white, 43.7. Those who are black, 34.6. Those who are Asian American, 37.5. Latino A, Latinx, 29.8. And biracial, 20.9, a category that continues to emerge. 2021, there are 6 states, plus Washington, D.C., in which the minority, meaning the racial ethnic minorities in the United States, within those states are minority as majority: California, New Mexico, Nevada, Hawaii, Texas, Maryland. It used to be 4 states, now it's 6. 2041, 2042, these are the latest projected years in which minorities will become the majority. This is from the Texas Tribune, since now I live in Texas. People of color made up 95% of Texas's population growth. Cities and suburbs are booming, the 2020 census shows. The state in which I live grew from 25 to 29 million, a 16% growth from one census in 2010 to the next one in 2020. For every new white resident between 2010 and 2020, there were 11 new Latinx residents. 95% of Texas's growth has been by people of color. In 2020, white Texans accounted for 39.8% of the population, down from 45% in 2010. And in 2020, Latino, Latina, Latinx Texans are 39.3%, less than 1% behind white Texans. This is from the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and it shows the total U.S. population from 2000 to 2019. On the left-hand side is the total U.S. population, and in the blue is the percentage of the white population from 69 to 63 to 60 in 2019. The African American population holding steady at 12%, the indigenous population holding steady at less than 1%, Asian American population jumping from 3.8% to 5.9%, those of multiple races jumping from 1.7% to 2.2%, Latino, Latina, Hispanic from 12.6 to 18.5, and that's for people over the age of 16. But if you look at under the age of 16, you see white population moving from 60 to 53 to 49. The black population holding steady around the same percentage. Same with the indigenous population. Asian Americans jumping from 3.4 to 5.2%. Those of multiple races and ethnicities from 3 to 4.5%. Latino, Latina, Hispanic from 17% to 25%. Now let me show it another way. This is 1960, in which 85% of the U.S. population was white and 15% non-white. This is 2012. And this is 2041, 2042. We will be preaching in an intercultural church with an intercultural future. Dare I say that we already are. Seminaries and divinity schools have also experienced the effects of these demographic shifts. The green line is the growth among black seminarians. Now, it peaked in 2013 and went down slightly and then headed back up. This is for F1 visa students. Now, we all know what happened in 2020. So there was a big drop among F1 visa students on account of restrictions related to studying in the United States. So there's no reason to believe that that number won't continue to move up and to the right as those restrictions have been loosened. The growth in the Asian American student population, the growth in the Latinx student population. That number is far too small in the sense that it's the most underrepresented number of students within ATS seminaries and divinity schools. So that number has grown significantly, but also would need to be tripled in order for it to be more closely aligned with our national demographics. This is the percentage of white enrollment from 2009 to 2021 at the same period. 59% in 2009, 48.5% in 2021. Now, there are lots of reasons that could account for this. College and universities are more diverse than ever. Some of this might have to do with rapid declines in mainline Protestant seminaries, which also are often predominantly white. Some of this has to do with the fact that many whites are disaffiliating from organized religion at a more rapid rate than people in other communities. You could factor in median age, birth rates. You could factor in the rapid increases in other demographics to also account for the ways that this is changing. Here's ATS schools in 2009. And here's ATS schools in 2021. The blue would be white students. Green would be minoritized students, so Black, Latinx, Asian American students. The yellow would be international students, and then there's these categories of not reported, not disclosed, and a new category that was introduced for those who are biracial. I'll show it one other way. Same time period. That's total headcount enrollment from 2009, total headcount enrollment in 2021. In particular, the growth of Latinx students is remarkable, 82%. But as I said, there's a long way to go. Here's how Daniel Aylshire puts it, the former president, the president emeritus of ATS. The scale and cultural presence of communities of color are likely the most compelling issue for the American church and for the seminaries related to the American church. Sociologist R. Stephen Warner refers to this as the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. Aylshire himself warns against seminaries and divinity schools creating boutique cultures rather than having eyes open and arms open to the shifts taking place in North America. And so we come again to Diana Butler Bass, to the description of a great religious recession. What if she is right and wrong? That's a great professor answer, right? What if the answer is both yes and no? To a certain extent, her assertions are accurate and descriptive, or I should say helpful in their descriptiveness, but only for a subset of the population. Yes, Americans are increasingly disassociating themselves from the word religious. Yes, according to recent USA Today polls, the number of religiously unaffiliated agnostics, atheists, is increasing exponentially compared to one generation ago. Yes, the number of those who are unchurched and de-churched continues to rise. But we should also ask questions. Are USA Today polls always the best indicators of realities on the ground? Who controls the narrative for religious growth and decline in the United States? And why? With whom are those controlling the narrative speaking? And who are they not speaking with? Does the phrase great religious recession really describe what is taking place overall, or does it describe subsets of churches at the same time, that other things are taking place, that there are other communities that may even be thriving and flourishing? There are 100 reasons why American Christians should think and talk about refiguring what it means to be the church in the United States, recasting reductive labels and binaries, even assessing Christianity's recession from the center to the margins of American civic life. But to say that American Christianity is undergoing a great religious recession, perhaps that is premature. How many Portuguese-speaking Brazilian Pentecostals in Boston take USA Today polls? How many Nigerian Christians in Detroit? How many Mandarin-speaking Chinese Christians in New York? How many Korean immigrant Christians in Los Angeles? How many Latino Christians living at the border and in all other metropolitan cities and small cities as well? How many take USA Today polls from those communities? What if this counter-narrative has the power to breathe new life into the popular narrative? What if we really are stepping into an intercultural church with an intercultural future? Now, you might have an image in your mind of the typical immigrant to the United States, what their religion is, how they dress, what their customs are. But according to the Pew Forum on Religious Life, this is from 2014, 68% of those who immigrate to the United States who are documented self-identify as Christian. 4% Muslim, 4% Hindu, 1% Buddhist, 1% Jewish, 1% other religion, 20% unaffiliated, which is an ambiguous category. That number does not include the more than 11 million undocumented migrants, many of whom, if not most of whom, self-identify as Christians. Jehu Hansel makes this observation in his book Beyond Christendom. The overwhelming majority of post-1965 immigrants are of non-European stock and come from over 150 countries. The non-Western origins and incomparable diversity of post-1965 immigrants are crucial considerations in estimating their long-term impact on America's religious landscape. So is the indication that the majority are Christian. Hansel also points to high rates of evangelism and conversion within immigrant communities. The larger claim that he makes in this book is that every migrant is a potential missionary. The voices of those who recognize and embrace this reality and understand its importance for churches and for theological education will become more rather than less relevant to theological discussions and church discussions in the future. And with respect to my discipline, more relevant to homiletical practice and reflection. Mark Gornick makes this observation. In New York City, you don't have to travel to another country to experience African Christianity. All you need to do is get on the subway. I was looking recently at some of the most post-Christian cities in America, and in the top 20, not to my surprise, was Boston, Massachusetts, where I used to live. And there's truth to it. Many of the top 20 post-Christian cities in America are located in New England, and for compelling reasons. But I wonder if those observations and those surveys take into account what has been called the quiet revival in Boston, an unprecedented and sustained period of Christian growth beginning in 1965, persisting for nearly 5 decades. The Emmanuel Gospel Center makes this observation. The number of churches in Boston has doubled during this period, though the population is about the same now as then. Are we hearing that? Twice as many churches without any change in the population. Boston's Christian church community is characterized by a growing unity, increased prayer, maturing church systems, and a strong and trained leadership. The spiritual vitality of churches birthed during the Quiet Revival has spread, igniting additional church development and social ministries in the region and across the globe. Have you heard of the Quiet Revival? in Boston. Wesley Gramberg Michelson makes a similar claim when he writes, an estimated 214 million people in the world today are migrants living in a country different from where they were born. Nearly half of these migrants are Christians, about 105 million, far more than the proportion of Christians in the world, which is about 33%. And for these Christians who are on the move, the United States is their chief destination. They presently account for about 32 million, or 13% of the Christian community in the United States. That percentage will continue to rise. These new immigrant Christians are changing America's religious landscape. Yesterday, I was just looking through emails and thinking about different things related to work at Baylor and at Truett. We're doing a hire for a faculty position in world Christianity and witness. And one of the people who we spoke with was interviewed as part of an article written by Trish Harrison Warren as an op-ed in the New York Times. This is yesterday. I didn't contact Trish in order to set this up. The global transformation of Christianity is here. Tish Harrison Warren. We often hear that the most significant trend in religion in America is the rise of the nones, those who profess no religious affiliation. That demographic group is indeed important for the future of religion, culture, and politics in America. And as of 2021, Pew reported that 29% of all adults identified as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular. But alongside that trend, she writes, the changing demographics of Christianity promise to transform faith and religious discourse. We cannot assume that America will become more secular so long as the future of America is less white. This browning of the church, that's not her term, that's a term from a previous article. Some scholars call it the browning of the church, messes with categories. What we see is not simply that white evangelicalism is changing or white mainline Christianity is changing. It's that something new is emerging. I think of my friend, someone who I went to school with, Manoj Shrestha, a pastor who's from Nepal, pastoring a church in Maryland and in the D.C. area. I wanted to find a sermon that I could share with students in my class, and when I looked for him on YouTube, I found out that he had 10,000 followers on YouTube. When he started seminary in 2008, there were 5 Nepalese immigrant churches. By 2015, that number had jumped to 150. By 2023, that number is well over 200. Christianity in Nepal was at 2%, now it's at 10%. Christianity among those who are from Nepal in the United States is rising at an exponential rate. In the year 1990, there were approximately 2,000 Korean churches. Recent estimates place that number at over 4,000. According to sociologist Mark Mulder, in his book, Latino Protestants in America, Latino evangelical churches are the fastest growing evangelical churches in the United States. This community demonstrates much higher levels of religiosity than Anglo-Protestants and other Latino Catholics. Mulder comments, they go to church, they pray, they read the Bible more than any other community. So that raises the question, what do we need? As we think about sermons in 2040, what do we need as we think about the future of Protestant Christianity in the U.S.? And I'm quoting from James Stewart here, who reminds preachers that we're called to be both timeless and timely. Stewart writes, the gospel is not for an age, but for all time. Yet, it is precisely this particular age, this history's hour and no other, to which we are commissioned by God to speak. What I want to submit is the development of various competencies that will help us move from here to there, to help us be more prepared for an intercultural church with an intercultural future, that will help us preach in a way that is, yes, timeless, but also timely. Yes, faithful, but also fitting. That's Nora Tisdale's language in her book, Preaching as Local Theology and Folk Art. Now, before I share these ideas with you, I want to make it abundantly clear that I am not suggesting that we get rid of the competencies that we are already trying to hold dear in seminaries and already trying to help students realize in their education. We still need theological competency. You don't need me to tell you that bad theology can do a lot of damage in a church. We need biblical exegetical competency. When I was in my early 20s, I received a birthday card, and in that birthday card, the quote was this one: "Celebrate by sending each other gifts, Revelation 11, verse 10. And I thought, that doesn't sound right, Revelation 11, verse 10. So I looked up the verse, which reads, "The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts." Because these two prophets had tormented those who live on the earth, end quote. I thought, either this friend knows me and wants to say something, or they didn't check when they got the card. Makes me think of what Kevin Van Hooser says: we must practice radical neighbor love toward one another, and we must also practice radical neighbor love toward texts. Respecting them, respecting the world in which they were written, the people to whom they were written, texts in their contexts. We still need relational competency, pastoral intelligence, emotional intelligence. Ian Pitt Watson, in his book Preaching a Kind of Folly, makes this observation: so often our failure as preachers, he writes, is our failure as pastors in disguise. We need spiritual competency. That's another way of saying integrity and uprightness in our relationships, emotional health, the fruit of the Spirit. The last thing people need is pastors to abuse their authority. We need preaching that lives. Yes, we need preaching that lives, but let me suggest that we also need lives that preach. Robert Louis Gilbert, the father of Kenyatta Gilbert, used to put it this way: 75% of your sermon is the life that you live. Now, with all of that stated, this recognition that we need to continue seeking out these competencies, let me propose some other competencies that will help us move forward as we prepare for an intercultural church with an intercultural future. And the first one is intercultural competency. Let me say more about what I mean. Interculturally competent preachers are willing to interrogate their own cultural values and adopt an intercultural mindset. By cultural values, I mean the beliefs and values that guide being and doing in a community that lie beneath the surface of its customs and rituals. We learn about the cultural values in other communities, and we're also willing to interrogate our own. Here I lean on the work of Geert Hofstadter's book, Culture's Consequences, along with his other publications. Now, I can't go into each of these. Let me say that our cultural values are what guide our thinking and being and doing in relation to others, and they also impact how we read Scripture. We have to be careful not to romanticize one over against the other. It does help us understand the Bible much better if we're willing to take off individualistic lenses and put on collectivistic lenses of interpretation. For the biblical writers are writing to a collectivistic society. Yet even so, the gospel simultaneously accepts us where we are and challenges us to move from where we are. In a collectivistic society, Mary sings a song, "You have been mindful of the state of your humble servant," which literally means you have looked upon me, the one who is poor, the one who is marginalized and left out, the one who is a woman in a patriarchal society. You've looked upon me. Jesus tells a story about a shepherd who's willing to leave 99 sheep in order to find one. The gospel also pushes back against our individualism. Whenever I hear 1 Corinthians 13 read at a wedding, even though I've done it myself, I'm reminded of the fact that Paul is calling the whole church to grow up and to stop being spiritually immature. That's a word to a community, not just to me. And in its context, it means something different than what we usually make it mean. An intercultural mindset means an ability to think and act in an adaptive manner, to navigate and negotiate cultural difference. Here I draw from the work of Milton Bennett, Mitchell Hammer, their work on the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is one of only 2 intercultural assessments that has been vetted and approved by the Board of Education in the United States for use at colleges and universities and not just K through 12 schools. This movement to an intercultural global mindset means we're willing to make sense of cultural differences and commonalities based on our own and other cultures' values and practices. We're willing to use cultural generalizations to recognize cultural difference and have more complex perceptions and experiences of cultural difference and commonality. What's not on this screen is a willingness to tolerate ambiguity and suspend judgment. Is that something we're good at in 2023? Tolerating ambiguity, suspending judgment. This isn't the only form of assessment. I think of David Livermore's work on cultural intelligence. Matt Kim, my colleague at Truett Seminary, has written a wonderful book called Preaching with Cultural Intelligence, in which he draws on Livermore's work. Now, I have to put a Gardner Taylor reference in here. I just have to. It's written into my contract. Taylor understood this in the 1950s. Our culture is a given. We are all children and products of it. But having said that, culture is not a prison. It does not have to restrict us. It does not have to circumscribe us. We are not owned by our culture. It is secondary identity over which we rank the demands of God. Let me suggest that the closer we get to ranking the demands of God at the center of our very existence, the more willing we'll be to think and act interculturally. I was speaking with someone who secures grants for state universities in Texas, and I said, it must be so much easier for you to do that because you have access to all of these levers that we don't have access to because we're a Christian private university. And he said, yes, but what you've forgotten is this: you can link that work to your mission. Another competency to consider is racial ethnic competency, which in many ways connects back to an intercultural competency. I'm defining racial ethnic competency this way. Racially, ethnically competent preachers are sensitized to how racialization impacts all of us. Let me define that. Racialization is a socially constructed process by which individuals, communities, and societies consciously or unconsciously define race and ethnicity, attach meaning to these categories, and inscribe racist attitudes, actions, and structures. Michael Emerson, in his book that he co-wrote with Christian Smith, Divided by Faith, suggests that racialization is a shape-shifter, that as time progresses from generation to generation, the way that racialization impacts various communities, it shifts shapes, it moves. It's hard to actually get our minds around and our heads around. Yet, in many different ways, we could unconsciously participate in those kinds of racist attitudes, actions, and structures that only strengthen it. They write, racialization is so embedded within the normal everyday operation of institutions that people need not intend their actions to contribute to racial division and inequality for their actions to do so. Beyond an individual person's actions, institutions, and structures, they can, quote, reproduce racialization without any need for people to be prejudiced. Often, they write, the leaders in reproducing racialization in the post-civil rights era are those who claim to be least prejudiced, as traditionally measured. I saw this play out in a commercial that appeared in the Super Bowl several years ago. Let's watch it together, and we'll look at the various reactions to it. This commercial came out 9 years ago. I wonder what would happen if it came out today. So you had various reactions, positive ones. You know what? Our diverse country is beautiful. Thank you. Best ad of the first half. Thanks, Coca-Cola, for reminding us that we're beautiful because of and not in spite of our linguistic diversity. That Coke commercial is everything that's right with America. And while I won't be drinking Coke anymore, hey, at Coca-Cola, this is America. English, please. Nice to see that Coke likes to sing an American song in the terrorists' language. Apparently, this is a thing. Some terrorists were singing our song in that Coke commercial. Coke must have missed the memo that this is America and we speak English. What used to make America great was that immigrants who came here from other countries learned our language and their cultures blended into ours. We were a melting pot of different cultures who managed to communicate with each other, and that ability tied us together. No longer. Sometimes I'll read quotes from a letter, and in the letter the person says, they're taking over our streets, the signs are in the language, they're taking over our schools, they're draining our resources, our doctors' offices, they're draining our economy. It was a letter written by Benjamin Franklin to a friend about Germans in Philadelphia. And so I help students see that just as we're a nation of immigrants, we're also a nation of anti-immigrants as well. Secular competency. I did try to point to Bast's assertions and see that there's truth to them. Secular competent or secularly competent preachers account for a secular web of beliefs that shape knowing, being, and doing. Secularization I define as a conscious or unconscious move away from organized religion and corporate worship toward irreligion, New Age spirituality, atheism, agnosticism, anti-religion, and even bad religion. Ross Douthat wrote a book called Bad Religion. You can also read Ken Dedene's book, Almost Christian. You can read Christian Smith's book as well about Christian belief, in which they make the proposal that what they're seeing in their surveys is a form of moralistic therapeutic deism. Christianity's misbegotten step-cousin, they call it. Also, within a secular society, we replace old altars with new ones. These three sociologists of religion, Floyd Thomas, and Toulouse, argue that the new altars are body and sex, big business, entertainment, sports, politics, science, and technology. Americans, they argue, have not so much abandoned religion per se as they have abandoned the old altars of organized religion for the new ones created and commodified by American culture. So they write in the conclusion, decreasing numbers at the altars of organized religion has not meant the cessation of worship. Worship continues at new altars. Michael Brothers tells this story in his book, Distance in Preaching, about how his daughter invited one of her friends, she was a little girl at the time, invited one of her friends to join the choir because the friend liked to sing. This was the church choir, so the friend started coming to rehearsal. The friend then invited her dad to the Easter Sunday morning service in which the children's choir would sing, and someone who was unchurched didn't know when to stand up, didn't know when to sit down. It got to the point in the service in Luke's gospel when Mary says to the angel, "They have taken my Lord away, and I do not know where they have laid him." The father turns to the daughter and asks, "What happened to him?" He didn't know the answer to what happened to him. One of my friends who's a pastor in Los Angeles, this was a beautiful wedding on Malibu Beach with all these beaches of Malibu with all these high society people, read from 1 Corinthians 13, the text I mentioned earlier, and he noticed a smattering of applause after he concluded, and person after person who came up to him said, "That poem that you wrote about love was beautiful. It was inspired." He said, "Well, it wasn't me." Or the pastor I know in New York who says, Whenever I talk about Abraham and Sarah, I have to assume that some people think they're new members at our church. So as we think about secularization, the secularization of the mind, as Peter Berger calls it, Berger started as pro-secularism, moved toward being anti-secular, and then at the end of his life said that there is a secularization of the mind, a secularization of our thinking, at the same time that we face this massive challenge, a challenge far greater than secularization, pluralism. This is from his book, The Many Altars of Modernity. But as we think about the secularization of the mind and how it would impact our hearers as preachers, we're called to take more responsibility for our reputation out there, to shine the mirror before we point the finger, to attend to the power of narrative and testimony, to remember that biblical illiteracy is pervasive in our society, and to assume that more and more people won't know what happened to him. Ask questions like, what are we for? Instead of just, what are we against? And to see the gospel that we preach as a way not only to critique irreligion, but also to critique bad religion. Improvisational competency. Effective intercultural preachers are improvisationally competent preachers. To be improvisationally proficient means that you're willing to riff on your tradition and to negotiate difference with protean reflexivity. That sounds very academic, so I'll make it a little more concrete. The ability to do a new thing in a new way as guided by convention, intuition, and interaction. That's what improvisation is about in music. That's what it's about in theater. And that's what it could be about, and maybe even should be about, in sermons in 2040. Preachers who abide by rules and constraints that shape preaching. Preachers who trust somatic hunches, that's from performance theory, during the sermon. And preachers who read and respond to listeners as co-participants or spect-actors. This is already happening in so many black churches and Latinx churches and Asian American churches where there's call and response. But even Henry Mitchell points this out. He says, you think that there's no call and response in churches where people aren't talking back to you? There is. Instead of talk back, it's feel back. You know how it's going when people are falling asleep on you. When they're furrowing their brow, when they're leaning forward, when they're lapsing in and out of attention, people are sending messages to you all the time. The jazz of preaching. Kirk Byron Jones writes, did you add something? Did you refine something? Did you say something different or say something in a different way? These competencies, intercultural competence, racial ethnic competence, secular competence, improvisational competence, are really guided by this last one, convictional competency. Convictional competency. Interculturally competent preachers recognize the dignity of difference, and they're willing to cross borders for the sake of the gospel. I define a border crosser as a Christ follower who abides by the call of the early church. And this is from the Epistle to Diognetus, that, quote, every foreign land is to them a fatherland, and every foreign land a fatherland. In every fatherland a foreign land. Rowan Williams makes a similar claim. The believer standing where Jesus stands is not someone who can only be at home in a specific bit of this worldly territory. He or she has become a person at home everywhere and nowhere. To be a border crosser is to be willing to go the direction that Jesus takes us, even if it's a place you'd rather not go. To be a person who has this convictional competency is to be a person who remains committed to the dignity of difference that is in all of us as image bearers. Jonathan Sachs writes, the test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideals are different from mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing God to remake me in God's image. Preachers with convictional competence embrace a cruciform conviction that guides their willingness to cross borders for the sake of the gospel. In many respects, too many to count, the cross of Christ and the empty tomb of Christ is the wellspring of Christian identity, the focal point of Christian preaching, and the fuel that can and should fire our commitment to crossing borders for the sake of the gospel, to being preachers who are well prepared to preach sermons in 2040. Thank you.